After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, his successors ruled over the most powerful kingdom on earth, the Yuan dynasty. A little over 70 years later, the dynasty was pushed from China, their rulers a shadow of the men Chinggis, Mongol and Kublai had been. Today we take you through the combined economic, environmental, political and military factors that led to the Mongols losing the Mandate of Heaven and China itself. We want our viewers to feel good, to look nice and to smell awesome. And if you want to do the latter, the sponsor of this video, Scentbird, is exactly what you're looking for. Scentbird is a fragrance subscription service that gives you access to over 600 brands. It is a flexible subscription, skippable without penalties. It will allow you to choose a new designer fragrance to try every month for just $16. Every month you get to pick what you want to receive. You'll get a 30-day supply, so you can try out fragrances before committing to a full bottle, and can upgrade to receive 2 or 3 products a month. Scentbird works directly with designer brands like Prada and Versace, and with indies like Vince Camuto and The Harmonist, which means that every product is 100% authentic. Scentbird sent us 4 of their products, including the favourite of our main historian Hugo Boss Infinite. As you can see, they come in stylish, easy-to-carry cases, and the bottle design is ergonomic and cool. The full bottles of these fragrances usually cost anywhere between $150 to $500, but you can try them out for just $7 using our code KINGS55. Discover new fragrances by taking a simple quiz on Scentbird. Based on your preferences, previous purchases and quiz answers, they'll help you to find the fragrance you'll love. Click the link in the description and use KINGS55 to get 55% off your first month at Scentbird. By the time of Kublai Khan's death in 1294, he had outlived his designated heir, passing it instead onto his drunken grandson, Timur-ul-Jeytu. In the almost 40 years from Kublai's death to the ascension of Turkun Timur Khan in 1333, 9 Khans were enthroned. Of them, only Timur-ul-Jeytu reigned over a decade. Rampant alcoholism and assassinations meant few Khans lived past 35. Timur-ul-Jeytu attempted to continue the policies of his grandfather, but within a year the treasury was nearly empty, almost totally spent on lavish gifts for the princes after his enthronement. He learned too of the intense corruption of the Yuan court. The quota for court and capital officials was set at 2,600 persons. In the first year of Timur-ul-Jeytu's reign, it was found to be over 10,000. A 1303 investigation led to some 18,000 clerks and officials being charged with bribery. In typical fashion, Timur-ul-Jeytu lacked the commitment to push through with charges, and most of the accused maintained their posts. While it has been common to attest the Yuan dynasty's economic failings to corruption and lavish gift-giving, of which there was no shortage of, recent studies have highlighted a greater struggle. The 14th century was the start of the Little Ice Age, a global climatic shift towards generally cooler and wetter temperatures. Those strongly affected the Asian monsoon season, which in the 14th century manifested into a general trend of intense colds and snowfall in the Eurasian steppe, droughts in North China, and unending rains and typhoons in southern China. These began to be felt in the very first years of Timur-ul-Jeytu's reign. In 1295, typhoons struck the Yangtze River Delta. The Yellow River broke its banks in multiple places and caused repeated flooding, and a dry spell from the previous years resulted in plagues of locusts that eradicated crops and continued for the rest of the decade. In Mongolia, harsher winters starved herds and forced thousands south to seek support from the Khan. These ecological problems directly tied into the Yuan's economic woes. Kublai continued the Song policy of Huang Zheng, government-provided disaster relief, in the form of cash, grain, rice, animals, and other supplies. It fit well into Kublai's efforts at reconstruction and relieving the burdens of the lower classes. None of Kublai's heirs dared repeal such a law, for it was the basis of Yuan legitimacy. However, in a century of unprecedented climatic disasters over a vast geographic area, this was an impossible burden. The detailed Chinese records and the Yuan Shi reveal a dynasty facing yearly crises. From 1272 until 1357, there was a major famine somewhere in China almost every other year. Over 56 earthquakes were recorded. Super typhoons on the southern coast coincided with super snowstorms in the steppe. Exceptionally cold winters and unexpected frosts meant certain crops could no longer be grown in the north. The densely populated Yangtze River Delta, home to one of the most economically and agriculturally vital areas of the empire, suffered annual droughts, flooding, epidemics, starvation, and typhoons, which destroyed towns and farmland, causing thousands more to die in the ensuing famines. In 1301 alone, a spring drought in the Yangtze Delta was followed by a massive typhoon. Arable farmland was destroyed for 50 kilometers along the coastline, and a 40-meter high wave pushed 280 kilometers inland. 17,000 were killed during the storm, and 100,000 starved in the aftermath. Only a month later, flooding displaced people in Manchuria. A freak August snowstorm killed herds in Mongolia. The imperial capital of Dadu was flooded, and a locust plague struck Hebei province. Survivors needed government relief. Grain and rice shortages caused the yuan to cover costs only with cash, and to provide more cash, more had to be printed, to the point it outstripped government revenues. Inflation was the result, and yuan paper money became ever more worthless over the 1300s. With seemingly unending waves of natural calamities and an ever more worthless currency, it seemed the yuan were losing the mandate of heaven, the right to rule China. On Timur Uljetu's death in 1307, without surviving children, factions formed around his nephews. His nephew Kaishan was a man of the steppe, with no love or understanding of Chinese culture. Hoping to rule like a nomad through his noyad, Mongol military elite, lavish gifts, princely titles and palaces were spent on his friends and allies. 4 months into his reign, Kaishan found he spent over a year's worth of government revenue. In a panic, he spent the rest of his reign trying to address this, increasing taxes and collecting debts cancelled by Timur Uljetu. A new currency was put into circulation, based on an exchange of 1 to 5 with the old. The volume of currency printed in 1310 was 7 times higher than the previous 3 years, succeeding only in furthering inflation. On his death in 1311, he was succeeded by his brother Ayurbawada. The new Khan unleashed a violent purge of his brother's officials, reversed his policies, and abolished his currency. Ayurbawada wanted a more traditionally Chinese Confucian government, and reinstated the civil service examination system to choose officials. He promoted the translation of Chinese classics into Mongolian, and began the codification of the Yuan legal system. Such was the ongoing back and forth with each new Khan, with the top layer of government usually suffering a bloody overhaul and total reversal of policies with each succession. Ayurbawada died in 1320, aged only 35. His son and successor, Shidibala, spent most of his reign battling Ayurbawada's powerful mother, only to be assassinated in 1323. His successor, his cousin Yesun Timur, was likely involved in the plot, and after only 5 years on the throne, died in 1328 of illness, also only 35. Yesun Timur's 8-year-old son, Ragibag, was enthroned at Chengdu on the efforts of Yesun Timur's chancellor, but the plan went awry when the central capital at Dadu was seized by the head of the powerful Kipchak Guard, El Timur, who placed Prince Turk Timur on the throne. El Timur violently seized Chengdu, and young Ragibag Khan disappeared in the chaos. Soon after, Turk Timur's older brother, Kushila, returned from his exile in the Chagatai Khanate. In August 1329, they met in a warm reunion, Turk Timur recognizing his brother's overlordship. 4 days later, Kushila was dead, and Turk Timur returned to the throne. But Turk Timur did not enjoy power for his efforts, for El Timur of the Kipchak and his ally Bayan of the Merkit held real power, reducing the Khan to a figurehead. The Khan dedicated his reign to studying Chinese classics, practicing his calligraphy, and suffering immense guilt over his brother's murder. When he died in 1332, he had declared his brother's son, Irinjibal, as his heir in place of his own minor son, An aging and ill el-Timur reluctantly agreed, and the 6-year-old Irinjabal was duly enthroned as Great Khan, only to die 2 months later. The court pressured el-Timur to recall Irinjabal's exiled older half-brother, Toghon Timur, though not before el-Timur married his daughter to him. Toghon Timur was the longest reigning Yuan sovereign after Kublai, ruling from 1333 until his death in 1370. At first, he, like his predecessors, was a puppet. On el-Timur's death, his ally Bayan took his place. He desired restoration to an imagined good old days under Kublai and sought to enforce separations between Mongols and Chinese, which had blurred over previous decades. Chinese were banned from many government offices, forbidden from learning Mongolian and other West Asian languages, the civil service examinations were cancelled, the general population disarmed, and their horses were confiscated. Yet Bayan also wanted to make the government more efficient by cutting court expenditures and reducing stress on the empire's population by decreasing the high fees on the salt monopoly, encouraging agriculture, and improving and speeding up the government relief system. All his efforts were, of course, signed off by the young Toghon Timur, who lived in fear of him. Bayan's centralization of power and willingness to respond to rumors of threats with great violence galvanized resistance to him, including by his own nephew Togto. In spring 1340, Togto and Toghon Timur exiled Bayan, who died a month later. With him went the last of those who wanted to go back to the old ways, succeeded by those who recognized and even celebrated the Sinicization of the Mongol dynasty. The new generation of court leadership was symbolized by Togto. Only 26 years old at Bayan's ouster, Togto was well educated and raised to prominence by his uncle. Unlike Bayan, Togto had no misconceptions about restoring things to Kublai's time. To Togto, Chinese culture and Confucianism were to be appreciated. Believing all dynastic problems could be solved with a steady hand and powerful government, Togto sought to centralize and strengthen the Yuan with a variety of reforms. His first period as chancellor saw the removal of the last of Bayan's allies, the restoration of the civil service examinations, greater incorporation of Confucian scholars into government than ever before, and actual visibility to Toghon Timur Khan. The Khan's family gave a decree denouncing his uncle Tugh Timur for murdering Koshila and had Tugh Timur's surviving son executed. Toghon Timur's own son, Ayushiridara, was entrusted to Togto to be raised and educated, and Togto put great energy into molding the boy into an ideal Confucianized Mongol ruler. Throughout this political upheaval, the environmental crises only worsened. The flight of the Mongols and other peoples of the northwest grew so bad that in 1323, 39% of the money printed was spent on trying to send the refugees back with aid, before ultimately forbidding anyone from leaving Mongolia on pain of death. Intense flooding every year of the 1320s annihilated croplands, and inflation only continued to rise, and the population grew ever more agitated. Over Tugh Timur's 3-year reign, 21 rebellions broke out. No new revenues could be found to pay for these expenditures, while the costs of relief, war, the court and corruption continued to soar alongside inflation. While Chancellor Togto imagined carrying out great works to dazzle his contemporaries, his plans were cut short by the environment. This was a decade of annual earthquakes, unseasonal snowstorms eradicating entire herds, severe flooding, widespread famine, drought and epidemic, including, in the opinion of some scholars, the start of the bubonic plague. For the general population, the field of frustration finally began to bloom into violent uprisings in the 1340s. In 1341, there were over 300 bandit uprisings across central China, including the Red Turban movement. So called for their red headbands, this was a number of loosely connected groups which espoused a radical Confucianism, calling for a drastic change of society through military means to return to an older, purer China. Togto resigned his position in 1344, allowed his successor to take the blame, then returned triumphant in 1349 when recalled by the court. As by then Togon Timur Khan had grown bored of governing, Tokto was now the dominant figure of the Yuan realm. Tokto ordered the printing of great sums of money to tackle his greatest scheme, forcing back the Yellow River to once more enter the sea south of the Shandong Peninsula. Back in 1344, 20 days of non-stop rain caused the river to break its banks and flood numerous districts and cities, cutting off the Grand Canal and draining into the Huai River, which caused it to rise and threaten the salt fields in Shandong and Hebei provinces, all before settling into a course north of the Shandong Peninsula. The threat to the salt fields was a particular concern, as the salt trade and its taxes provided 6/10 of Yuan yearly revenue, while the Grand Canal needed to be kept open to transport rice and grain north to feed the capital of Dadu. There was intense opposition to the project to reroute the Yellow River, but Tokto forced the plan through, printing 2 million ingots worth of new currency to pay for it. From May to December 1351, 150,000 labourers and 20,000 soldiers dug a 140-kilometre-long channel to successfully reroute the river. Once more the Grand Canal was fed, the salt fields were protected, and the Yellow River exited into the sea south of Shandong. Tokto's project was designed to protect the producers and economy of the Yuan dynasty, but it accidentally sparked off its ultimate collapse. The large gathering of workers, hungry and weak from years of famine, punished by cruel overseers trying to meet a strict timetable, and paid in money only a little above worthless, was fertile soil for the Red Turbans. Even as work continued on the canal, a massive revolt erupted in the Huai River Valley. The Yuan were taken by surprise, and a number of cities fell in quick succession, with few city walls having been rebuilt after the initial conquest. In the first engagements, the government forces were poorly prepared and beaten back, including an army commanded by Tokto's brother. These were not the highly mobile horse archers of the conquest, but generally local Chinese militias commanded by Mongols and Central Asians. But Chancellor Tokto was custom-made for this emergency. He immediately organized the defense, raised new armies, and conscripted militias. New training and command structures were implemented. He knew he had to tread carefully, lest mismanaged and underpaid troops join in the revolts. In a dizzying juggling effort, Tokto constantly shuffled larger military units, transferring and reappointing commanders around the empire to prevent them from forming alternate power bases. The Yellow Army, mostly Chinese volunteers under Mongol and Turkic commanders in yellow uniforms, became Tokto's nationwide apparatus of pacification, as termed by historian John Dardis. Leading the most important campaigns himself, Tokto began to halt, then push back, and finally overrun the rebellion. By the end of 1352, Tokto had brought the Huai River Valley back under control. Methodically, they retook cities, and by the end of 1354, Tokto was about to crush the final major figure of a largely broken movement, Jiang Shicheng, now isolated in his capital at Gaoyu. And at the last moment, Togon Timur Khan snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. For unclear reasons, the Khan ordered Tokto dismissed at the start of 1355. A short-sighted and inept monarch, perhaps fearful of Tokto's growing might, yet at the same time unable to replace him, Togon Timur ensured that Tokto's carefully balanced military machine collapsed instantly, much of the army deserting, and the Red Turban Rebellion exploded with new vigour. Tokto, a loyal servant to the end, accepted his dismissal and was assassinated the following year. Togon Timur sat almost idle as the Red Turban warlords fought for the right to succeed the Yuan. After the Battle of Lake Poyang, this was Zhu Yuanzhang, who soon declared the Ming dynasty. Togon Timur had little power over his remaining commanders, who fought each other as much as the Red Turbans. By the end of the summer of 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang, now enthroned as the Hongwu Emperor, sent his trusted general Shu Da to take Dadu. Togon Timur and his heir Ayashiridara fled to Mongolia only days before the arrival of the Ming armies, and on the 20th of September 1368, Dadu came into Chinese rule for the first time in over 400 years. the Hongwu Emperor renamed the city to Beiping, meaning pacified north. In time, the city became the capital of the Ming dynasty and was renamed to Beijing, the name it holds today. Aside from a few Yuan loyalists who held out for another 20-odd years, Mongol rule in China ended in 1368. The Yuan dynasty, contrary to common depictions, had responded vigorously to a dramatic climatic emergency, but could not overcome such a massive crisis. Few states, though, could have survived such a threat, while simultaneously suffering rampant political and economic turmoil that was continually compounded by the environmental crisis. In this respect, it remains impressive that the successors of Kublai Khan lasted even 70 years. More videos on Mongol history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.